By the way, I got to show you this. You know you're vacationing in Canada when this is on the wall.
Dude, that's sick.
It's
Team Canada, 2002, eh?
there's all this memorabilia like all over this place.
Dude,
Isn't that funny?
That is
They've
great,
got-
man.
They've got like a Blue Jays. They've got like a World Series like Blue Jays thing. It's great.
1990. What year did they win? 80?
92, 93?
92, 93. Dude, Joe
I-
Carter.
That's the last. I think it was Kuiper. One game, he was talking about Joe Carter's. It was a walk-off grand slam, I think, in either 92 or 93
Yeah.
to win the World Series. He goes,
Win the effing World Series, bro. Insane.
Yeah. He goes, that's the last swing you take in the backyard when you're playing with your brothers or your
Literally.
friends.
You're playing wiffle ball.
World
And
Series,
you just hit jack.
bases loaded,
Yeah.
grand slam. Yeah,
Yeah.
gotta go in for dinner.
Yeah,
See you later.
See ya. Bye.
Ahoy, hoy. Welcome to HeadGames, the science and psychology of sports. I'm Dr. Brett Levine, joined as always by Dr. Ben Rosenberg. Ben, how are you?
Doing okay today, Brett. You are in a cabin. How are you?
I'm in a cottage, Ben. They call them cottages.
Cottage. Is
Yeah.
that a Canadian thing? They only have cottages.
Shout out to Canada. Shout out to the province of Ontario. I've heard a lot about Muskoka. This is my first time in Muskoka. It's basically just north of Toronto, as you probably can guess. It's just a bunch of lakes, beautiful lakes and trees. And like we always used to come here during the winter when it was miserable. And I'm like, why do people live here? And now, I mean, we went up to like this other place a few years ago, but this is my first time like on a real like Canadian lake in the summer. And it's like, I get it now. I understand why people endure the winters because this is amazing. The water's warm, trees, everything is in bloom. You get to stay in cute little cottages like this.
Cute cottages. Wait, so let me ask you this.
Yo.
Have you eaten any poutine?
Yes.
Dude, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you a big fan? Big fan?
I gained at least 4 pounds. Yeah.
Just from poutine, solo.
Poutine's amazing. It's great. Yeah.
Dude, it's gravy and fries. Like, how could you go wrong?
And cheese curds. It's amazing.
And cheese curds. Yeah.
All right, let's get to this. We're continuing this theme of COVID and sports. And now that, all three sports are in full swing, and there's certainly a lot of these variables. And I think there's some very interesting psychological takes on all this stuff that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. And it continues. We're going to talk a little bit about risk in this episode. But first, some news. We should probably talk about what's been going on in the three major sports that are back. So hockey's back. I think last week or 2 weeks ago, I said it was just in Edmonton. And I made fun of you because you didn't know if that was a state or a province.
True. Yeah, true. Which was it again? I forget.
Edmonton is a city and a province, you dingbat.
What province?
Alberta.
Got it.
Alberta.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
All right. So there's a bubble in Alberta, in Edmonton, for hockey. There's also a bubble in Toronto. They have, and this is, we're recording this August 9th. There are no positive tests in NHL. As far as I know, there's no positive tests. NBA hasn't had any either as of yet. And baseball's another story. And I think that's what we're going to get into today. Although I think there's something that can be said about these attitudes with other players. So real quick, for baseball, we all know, I think most currently there's been an outbreak on the Cardinals. They haven't played in a week. Tomorrow's game is canceled. And the next games this week are also sort of TBD. You can bucket them with the Marlins and the Phillies, who each had 7 games canceled each. And it's a big it's a topic on today's episode, which is risk, in particular what was going on with the Marlins. There was word that came out that was later sort of debunked by Derek Jeter that the players actually went out to like a club during the pandemic and within a state where there's like a lot of cases in Florida, right? Miami Marlins players went out and supposedly contracted coronavirus, and it spread throughout the team. It wasn't just a handful of players; it was like a lot of players, and they tried to, downplay it or whatever. But I think that's it's something worth talking about. Like, why are guys doing this? You can throw in Dwight Howard there, because Dwight Howard, based on, I guess, I don't know if it's risk taking, but his beliefs were that he's an anti-vaxxer, and he's like, I don't believe in vaccines, and I'm not wearing a mask, which is, I think, to TJ's point last week, it's easier to control those behaviors when you're in a bubble, as opposed to what we're seeing with what's going on in baseball, where you have complete autonomy to go to clubs. The prevailing idea, or the rationalization, which I think is easy, is that professional athletes are younger, they're really healthy, and they're young and dumb, I guess is a way to categorize them. And this is not to say that professional athletes as a whole are dumb. The saying is that they're young and they feel that they're invincible. And I think a lot of other young people, professional athletes or not, are also sort of behaving the same way.
Right.
And the topic today, and the question posed to you, is that there might be other things going on. It's not just a simple categorization of, these players are young and dumb, but there's other processes that are going on. It's a little bit deeper than just something very like surface level. So why don't you explain a little bit about what might be going on and dig a little bit deeper into this?
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point that is applicable to baseball and other sports, but also to the world more broadly, right? Or the US at least. We're seeing the biggest growth of cases among a younger kind of age group at this point. And so it begs the question, like, what the heck's going on here? And I mean, the kind of default response of that they're young and dumb is probably like partially true, right? They're young, they feel like they're less likely to get this seriously, which the data seem to support. But there's also some more stuff, I think, going on behind the scenes that it's worth talking about. So looking in the psych literature, there's a term that's, I think, particularly important here, which is risk perception. So people make decisions about the kinds of behaviors they're going to engage in, at least partially based on their perception. And when we're talking about risk perception, it's two things, right? It's whether or not I think something is going to happen to me. In this case, am I going to get COVID? And the second piece is, if I do get it, how bad will it be, right? So those two things combine to form our risk perception, how bad I think, how risky something is, how risky it is for me to engage in a given behavior. So there's a few points I think that are worth looking at a little bit to help explain players and other young people's behavior. The first is that our current emotional state, what psychologists call affect, influences our perceptions of risk, right? So if I'm in a crappy mood, if I'm not feeling great, I'm more likely to perceive that an event or doing something will lead to bad outcomes for me.
Okay.
The converse of that is that if I'm feeling good, happy, positive about things, stoked to be back playing baseball again, that I'm less likely to perceive that an event is going to bring negative outcomes to me if I go ahead and do it.
Okay. So if I hear you right, risk perception is two things. Number one, it's what's the probability that I get this thing? And number two is how bad is it going to be when I get it? And I think on the surface, like full stop right there, that is also sort of young and dumb, but it's not so dumb, because number one, the probability of getting COVID, while a lot of people have it, is low in any one circumstance, right? If 1% of a state has it, that's a lot of people. But if 1 out of every 100 people has it, the probability is pretty low.
Still very low.
And the research says that even if I do get it, if I'm young, no problemo. Like a lot of people are pretty much okay. It's really affecting like elderly people or people with pre-existing conditions. So on the surface, that seems on par.
A logical decision.
Right. Okay. And now what you're saying is the first part of that, though. The first part being, what's the probability of me getting this? When I weigh that out in my head, if I'm going to go to a club and I think, well, let's say I'm like 1 out of every, I don't know how many people, or the probability is low. That is going to depend also on how I'm feeling at that moment. Like if I'm feeling good, I'm going to be like, I got it. And if I'm feeling bad, I'm going to be like, I don't know.
Exactly. So I'm not purely weighing out the facts when I make these decisions, right? And as you said, the facts kind of support. It's a bad idea to go to a club. Don't go to a fucking club. But the facts kind of support that type of thinking, right? Inst. Because as you said, the data show that this is everywhere, right? COVID is everywhere. It's very transmissible, but your odds of getting it are still quite low. You increase them quite a bit if you do something like go to a club. But we're not simply weighing out those facts in a logical manner as we make these decisions. The way that we're feeling, as you said, plays into the decisions that we make, plays into the perceptions that we have about the event.
Right. Okay. Is that it? But it's just my mood, and then that's it, and that's what weighs into it?
Of course, that's not it. So this, I want to just also, kind of to rewind, preface this by saying this literature on risk perception is absolutely massive, and we're just pulling out a few particularly relevant things here. Okay, so just to sort of frame that more,
don't
more
at
broadly.
me.
Yeah, don't at me, risk perception researcher who is never going to watch
You're
this.
gonna get annihilated. Keep going.
Dude, good. Please, more eyes on us, the better. So a second perspective that I think lends a little bit to our discussion is this really interesting phenomenon that we see across a whole bunch of risk perception areas. And the idea is that when people make risk perception judgments about how likely it is something is to happen to me, we're much more optimistic in our judgments about ourselves versus other people. In other words, I'm never going to get cancer from smoking. I'm never going to get in a car accident. I'm never going to get divorced. Those people over there, that shit's going to happen to them, not going to happen to me. So we're overly optimistic in these kind of assessments that we make.
I've heard about this idea of exceptionalism, especially during COVID. Like, I'm more privy to information than other people. Is that the same thing? Is it intertwined as being overly optimistic and that I'm unique, or I'm the exception, or is it different?
The optimism thing, the phenomenon with that, I think is a sub kind of piece of the tendency to think that we're exceptional, right? This is just part of it. This is one kind of perceptual cognitive part of it where our perceptions of ourselves are at least partially based on this kind of tendency to be overly optimistic about risk assessment. And again, they've done studies on this tendency in a lot of different arenas, none that I know of specifically on COVID, but really, really relevant stuff, right? Again, like perceptions of likelihood of getting in a car accident, likelihood of a smoker getting a smoking related illness. That again is crazy to me. I'm a smoker. I'm less likely than these other smokers to get lung cancer or whatever, right?
Are you a smoker?
Overly optimistic. No.
You have a secret smoking habit? You have a secret smoking habit?
Dude. I dipped a little bit when I played baseball, but that shit's disgusting.
Cultural. All right.
Cultural.
Okay. All right. So I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing two things that you're saying that sort of explain those first two things you said. Number one was, what's the probability that I'm going to get this thing? How bad is it going to be?
Yeah.
Under that, you've already explained two other ideas, right? Number one was, I'm forgetting the first one because I'm on vacation.
Your affect, how you're feeling.
Right, you're feeling.
Emotional state.
And the second one was this level of optimism. Okay.
Correct.
And those help explain the assessment of risk?
Yes.
Just the first thing, the assessment. Okay.
Correct.
And I think both of those make sense.
Yeah, they help explain the extent to which we perceive an event is likely to impact us, or in this case, again, that we're likely to get COVID or not get COVID.
Okay.
So the third thing I think that's really important takes the next step, right? It tries to link our perceptions about risk, which is what we've been talking about, the things that influence our perception of risk. It tries to link that with people's actual risky behavior.
Okay.
So it's been presumed for years in this research that one is linked to the other. That if I perceive something as being more risky, that I'm less likely to engage in it, right?
Seems pretty simple.
X causes Y.
Right.
Seems pretty simple. And there's all these correlational studies, right, where they just measure a bunch of stuff that shows that X is related to Y, that risk perception is related to my risk-taking behavior. So a couple years ago, these pretty well-known social psychologist researchers did a meta-analysis. They took a shitload of experimental studies
Okay.
and combined the data from them because they wanted to test this specific question. Is risk perception related to risk-taking behavior?
Okay.
And the answer is much more nuanced than we would think, right? It's not always that perceiving something as risky is going to lead me to decide not to engage in it because I perceive it as risky, right? It's not a clear one-to-one relationship.
That doesn't make any sense though. If I think, going to a crowded supermarket is a bad idea, you're saying I'm actually going to do it, even though if I'm like, wow, this is really risky, I'm still going to do it.
It's not necessarily that you're going to do it, but it's not that you're not going to do it either, right? It's not a clear one-to-one thing. That there's lots of other stuff, lots of other factors, emotional state, like we talked about before, social influence, what the people around us are doing, norms. There's all these other factors that influence that relationship from perceiving something as risky and deciding whether or not I'm going to do it.
Okay, so we're talking about three things. We're talking about your emotional state when you make a decision. If I'm feeling good, I'm feeling great, let's do this. Or I'm not feeling great, I'm not going to do it. The second one was your level of like optimism about it, just in general, that on the whole, on the average is people, not just within risk assessment, we are generally optimistic about our own perceptions versus the everybody else. Is that true? Right. Okay. And then the third one being this like counterintuitive thing where it's like, even when all of this risk is weighing on me, I'm still going to do it.
Potentially, right? It's again that it's not a one-to-one relationship. There's risk. I could perceive it as being risky, but a lot of other things happen between X and Y. A lot of other things happen between my perceiving something as risky and deciding whether or not I'm going to do it. So again, are all my teammates saying, yeah, fuck it, we're going to go to the
That's another variable. Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, peer pressure.
Peer pressure, exactly. So this linkage between what I think about something and whether I'm going to do it or not is like very, very well established, kind of inconsistent relationship in the literature. People's attitudes don't always predict their behavior across a whole range of circumstances.
So then it screws with the first one, which was like how you're, okay, let's clear that up. The first one is how you're feeling.
Right.
The third one was your attitude, which is different than the way that you're feeling. Okay, so let's clear that up. So let's talk about the Marlins. Let's bring this all back, right?
Yeah.
A big group of Marlins players went. Let's just say, 14 guys went to a club. You're explaining this in the literature based on, number one, they're feeling good, right? The Miami Marlins, they're not a great team, but you know what? They're professional baseball players in Miami, and life's good. We're going to a club. All right.
Well, think about it. They're excited. Baseball's back, right? They've been sitting on their asses for the last 5 months, just like everybody else.
So generally, they're in a good mood.
They're stoked. Yeah, we're back with the guys. We're throwing the ball around again.
All right.
They're excited.
Okay, so that's number one. Number two, they're overly optimistic, maybe because they're professional players and they get the best doctors and they get the best information. They're like, I know more than other people, and therefore I have this protective barrier around me, and it's all good, and we've got the best medicine, and we're in good shape. That's number two.
Yep.
And number three is you're saying that their attitude, okay, even if their attitudes are, I don't know, I'm a little bit risky, right? The literature has shown that can be shattered based on other variables, other stuff, other like factors, peer pressure, like belief in aliens, anything else?
Anything. Yeah. I mean, the main things I think you hit, right? Peer pressure. There's really, really, really strong drive, especially on teams and groups like that, to conform to kind of the norms of the group, right? So particularly
team aspect.
Team aspect. So guys want to live up to kind of the team norm, what everybody else is doing. So that can be something that, as you said, can shatter that relationship between me perceiving it as risky and saying, well, screw it, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways.
Okay. So bringing this together, I think a lot of people just say, okay, players are young and dumb. And if you're not in your 20s anymore, and you go back and you put yourself in that mindset, is it easy enough to say, oh, I remember being that age and I just kind of did stuff. I didn't think before I acted, especially when your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, right? But what you're saying is that there's actually a lot of other stuff that's going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Is this stuff occurring even if we're not conscious of it? Is my brain making this calculate? If I'm 25 years old, my brain is still making these calculations, even though I'm not aware of it. You're saying it's how I'm feeling in that moment. I have higher levels of optimism because I feel like I'm special, and this weird other category that even if I'm have this attitude that it is a risk factor, that like it's easily influenced by my environment. All of this stuff is being calculated before I decide to go to a club.
Absolutely. And it's happening as you said, it's not most of it, at least happening at a conscious level. Like if we take a step back, most of human thinking can be kind of framed as two different systems, right? And we've talked about this some. There's your fast, kind of quick assessment of a situation, and then your slower, more drawn out judgments. So the first system, me making a quick kind of judgment about something, is based on things that we've talked about: my emotion, what's happening around me, what the guys near me are doing, that I'm not really necessarily consciously thinking about, right? Okay. Whatever kind of decision or judgment I make in that first stage influences my ultimate decision in the second stage. That's a bit more conscious. So if I make a judgment of like, everybody's going to go do this, I'm going to be the shithead sitting at the hotel. If I don't go do this, this is all again happening unconsciously. That judgment's going to influence what I decide to do in the moment. Do I go to the club or not? Do I put myself at risk or not?
Right. We were talking about this back in episode 3, I believe, where we're talking about racism, is that the brain is split into these two parts. Number one is like the quick thinking, the fast thinking one, which is decent, but it's inaccurate, right? But it saves energy. And it influences the second one, which is slower and more thoughtful and more accurate, but requires more energy. You're saying that's the case also with processing risk, because even though in the moment when I'm 25 years old, I'm like, I'm going to the club, it's a fast thinking thing that is actually kind of calculating all that stuff. It's calculating the risk for me quickly. It's not always accurate. It's not always a good decision, but that's the way brains work in general, is sort of like this blanket theory.
It's a pretty damn good blanket theory. I mean, certainly there are nuances, right? Other factors are going to enter into the equation, but it seems across a lot of psych research that those two systems come out over and over and over again. And right before we got on, I was just reading a paper about risk perception that was talking about this dual process kind of model, right? Oh, wow. Where our initial kind of unconscious hit about something influences our subsequent slower, more processed, more deliberate thought about something. Right. That ultimately will impact the decision that we make. Interestingly, though, it's also in the paper I was just reading, it's recursive, right? Like the decision we ultimately make feeds back into that initial kind of unconscious perception, which then affects the next decision we make, and so on and so forth, right? So it kind of goes in a circle.
That makes sense. Okay, well then, let's talk about this though. The whole idea of this focusing on baseball is that there's no bubble and there's an autonomy, and guys can at any moment decide to go to a club in Miami or Cleveland or wherever they may be, right?
Right.
I wouldn't rule out the fact that this is not going to happen within an NBA or an NHL bubble, because guys can maybe violate that in certain ways, or they can do riskier things, right? It just might be more probable in something like baseball where there's no bubble. So I think it is worth talking about. 2 questions for you. Number one, I like sports. I like watching professional sports. I want to keep watching them, and I don't want there to be outbreaks because guys go to a club. If you're Major League Baseball or you're any of these organizations that might be concerned about this, number one, how do we fix it? And number 2, make a prediction. What are we going to see in the future?
Well, I mean, I think we've clearly got enough evidence at this point to show that the bubble is the way to go, right? Like, you're taking away as much of that kind of individual decision-making that you're getting at from the players as you can. You're saying, you guys can do whatever the fuck you want in this bubble, but as soon as you go out, you have to quarantine when you come back in. You have to get all these negative tests before you can even re-engage with anybody. Look at what happened with Lou Williams when he went out, right? Like he went out, he went to a club, it was publicized immediately, comes back in, it takes a long time for him to get reintegrated into the team.
Yep.
MLB, these dudes went to a club or whatever they did, guys test positive, and they played the next day.
Yeah.
Right? So there's just too much variability when they're not in a bubble, clearly. So I mean, the obviously
you don't trust them. What you're saying is like the only way to do it is to do the bubble. You're saying people are going to think this way no matter what, and you don't trust people, and that's that.
Yeah, I mean, people just aren't always going to make logical decisions. I mean, that is economics, if they've learned nothing else, has learned that people aren't always rational thinkers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even though these guys know that the risk is potentially great of getting COVID and that what might happen could be really, really, really bad, they aren't necessarily going to act in line with that perception.
Yep. Okay. Make a prediction. What's going to happen in the future? Are we going to see more of this? Because I don't think baseball's bubbling anytime soon.
Yeah. Baseball's not going to bubble. Doesn't seem like football is going to bubble. Man, I wish I was more optimistic about the future of these things. I don't foresee baseball lasting all season.
Wow. Really?
This is going to go even more out on a limb. I think football maybe makes it through week 4 or something.
Oh my God.
We talked about this before. Like, I don't understand the guidelines they're putting out. Like, so guys can smash into each other for 60 minutes and then they can't exchange fucking jerseys after the game. Like,
right.
It doesn't make sense, right? The policies aren't congruent with the reality of how this thing is transmitted. And so because they're not going to be in a bubble, I'm not optimistic. I wish I could be. I mean, on the other hand, though, you look at like PGA Tour, they have done pretty well. They've had a bunch of events. They've been playing for a while. Very different, right? Obviously, it's not a contact sport in the same way. Social distancing is sort of built in. Right. But they've been playing for a while, and they're not in a bubble. These guys go home to their wives and kids and whatever, and like they've been okay. So yeah, I would love to be more optimistic. I just, knowing as much as we know about human behavior and human decision making, I'm not overly optimistic.
Great way to end the show on a positive note. Yeah, although you have had the ability to end on a positive notes in the past, I don't blame you because, you're right. I mean, it sounds like people are going to people. And the only way to really control for that is to kind of clamp down, especially when you're young and dumb.
Young and dumb. I mean, the bottom line really is, I think if leagues want this stuff, if they want to continue playing, they need to bubble. Basically, that's what's happening right now. And whether they do that or not, I mean, baseball's not. I would love to see football go to like an island or something and just frickin' play, man. Like, I need some fantasy football in my life, like really bad, real bad. Yeah. So that'd be great if they could do that, but I don't think it's going to fucking happen.
Okay. Well, we'll tweet it out. We'll see what happens. Please rate and subscribe where applicable for the show. You can find us on Twitter at HeadGamePsych. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Brett Levine, and you can find that guy on Twitter at BD Rosenberg, PhD. More of our content is on Psych today. If you want to read, some of the topics are posted up there, although we haven't written in a while. Maybe we should probably do that.
We should talk about that.
We should. Big thanks to Joshy boy Josh Baca for editing and producing the show. And thanks so much for tuning in.